All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we are beginning our year in breakdowns of each position group, starting with the quarterback spot. So today we're talking all about Matt Ryan, the past, the present, and the future of the Atlanta Falcons at the quarterback position.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong, however, on Twitter at falcfans, putting weekly content up at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons, and of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In today's episode of Locked On Falcons will feature me talking about the quarterback position. We're beginning our year-in positional breakdowns. We go each position group, starting off with the most important position on the field, the quarterback position. And we'll be talking quite a bit about Matt Ryan, reviewing his season, as well as what's next for the Falcons, not only for Matt Ryan, but potentially as they look ahead to potentially draft a quarterback that may or may not be a possible long-term solution to replace Matt Ryan down the road. But before we get into all of that, guys, I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as now on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And when you do, give us a thumbs up and give us that like. So let's start off by recapping Matt Ryan's 2021 season. And basically, if I was to summarize my assessment of Matt Ryan's 2021 going month by month, I would say September was pretty rough. October, he played great. November was again rough. And then December and heading into January, he was fine. All right. I think there are certainly factors, outside factors beyond Matt Ryan that lead to those outcomes. But I think one of the benefits I've had of watching film over the years and the last decade that I have been watching film on a regular basis is that you kind of learn to be able to isolate the quarterback from his environment, which usually revolves around being able to look at three factors that the quarterback typically has complete control over, and that's read, progression, and throw. And particularly during that November stretch of the season, I felt like Matt Ryan kind of struggled in those three areas, and Kurt Warner did a detailed breakdown of some of those instances on his YouTube channel. So I think he was looking at the Jaguars game. So go check that out. Maybe I'll link to it in the description below if you want to see that. But we're not going to get into that. We're not going to rehash that on today's podcast. We'll just kind of focus on those environmental, those outside factors that Matt Ryan doesn't necessarily have control over as a major contributing factor to why we saw a downturn in his season. And I certainly think the offensive line and its struggles were probably the biggest factor in why Matt Ryan struggled as much as he did this season. And we saw that especially at the beginning of the season and then towards the end of the season, particularly going into November. And then you also talk about the other factor, which is the lack of weapons, which particularly during that November stretch when Calvin Ridley first stepped away from the game, a lot of people blamed for Matt Ryan's struggles during that month. And I certainly think not having Calvin really did have a significant negative impact on Matt Ryan's play, although I don't know if it was as significant as some people would like to portray it in that regard. Like, it certainly had an impact, but I don't know if it was like the thing that made or broke Matt Ryan, as some people will portray it as. And part of the reason why I believe that is because to me, what Matt Ryan was missing was that sort of go-to do or die must have, those do or die must have situations, the guy that he could go to reliably in that situation. That's not really Calvin Ridley's game, particularly to win those contested catch situations in those instances. And really the player that has always been that guy for him throughout his career, and particularly over the last decade, was Julio Jones. And so when we talk about the lack of weapons, I think really what we're having a conversation about is not having Julio Jones this season. And particularly when we go back and look at the year one struggles that Matt Ryan has consistently had over the last 6-7 years, when the Falcons have made a change at the offensive coordinator position, going back to Kyle Shanahan in 2015, then transitioning to Dirk Cutter in 2017. Of course, Steve Sarkisian in 2017, Dirk Cutter in 2019, and now Arthur Smith in 2021. Up until this season, Julio Jones had always been there to be that dude that he could always rely on, that when he was uncomfortable with what the play was called, when he was not comfortable with the blocking in front of him and all these various factors, these environmental factors that weren't great for him, that weren't leading Matt Ryan to play his best football, playing with the timing, the precision, and at the level of play that we know he is capable of, he could always sort of say, look, I know this one guy's going to get open. I know this one guy's going to catch the football, and I can throw the ball. And if that means locking on Julio Jones, and so be it. And I think, you go back to a conversation we had before the season, back, I think, in August, talking about whether or not having Julio Jones be that guy this season was going to have a negative impact on the season, because then I talked about Calvin Ridley's not really that guy. And Kyle Pitts, to a lesser extent, is also not really that guy. As gifted as he is, when you go back and you watch his college film, that, like, he wasn't winning in those sort of contested catch situations to the degree at Florida that I think a lot of people assumed he was. Um, and I think that was somewhat on display this past season. And particularly during that November stretch, one of the things that we talked about on the podcast frequently was the frequency in which Matt Ryan was kind of locking in on Kyle Pitts, pre-snap and post-snap and whatnot. And it didn't necessarily really pay off for Matt Ryan in a major way, in the ways that it potentially could have if that had been Julio Jones in those situations. And that's not meant to be a knock on Kyle Pitts, as I am particularly optimistic that as his and Matt Ryan's rapport continues to develop and grow, going into this upcoming season, you will see Kyle Pitts grow more into that type of outlet that could be that sort of reliable option for him in those sort of do or die situations. So we'll see about that. And that's part of the reason why I do remain optimistic, despite my frequent criticism of Matt Ryan on this podcast, that, he will improve going from 2021 to 2022, as we have seen him consistently do going into year two with a new coordinator. To me, the question is going to be how much improvement Matt Ryan shows. And that's what we'll get into as we continue today's Locked On Falcons post-season year-in positional review of the quarterback position. But before we get there, guys, of course, I again want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And today, let's talk about the Locked On Hawks podcast, where host Brad Rowland is, as usual, killing it, giving you all the lowdown on all things Atlanta Hawks, giving you, the scoops on why the Hawks aren't necessarily performing up to expectations this season, and maybe ways that they can get back to that. So go check out the Locked On Hawks podcast, free and available on the same podcast platforms in which you can find Locked On Falcons. Now, it's a new year, and that means people have New Year's resolutions. And usually at this point in time in the month or the calendar year, a lot of people are dropping their New Year's resolutions. But a way that you can maintain, if one of those resolutions is eating healthier, is including a Built Bar in your plan. Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, even better than a candy bar. Eating healthy can be hard. It can also be pretty boring. And Built Bar makes eating healthier fun, makes it easier to stick to your resolution beyond 2 or 3 weeks, because Built Bars taste good. Taste so good, in fact, that you'll actually want to eat them. Even if you're not necessarily a huge fan of working out, you can at least eat something that tastes good and is good for you. Built Bars are low in sugar, calories, and carbs, high in protein and fiber. So go check out Built Bars at built.com. There's a variety of flavors, including Churro Puff. There are limited time flavor that is back. You can always get Churro Puff, eggnog, caramel macchiato, coconut brownie chunk, as well as the tried and true favorites like cookies and cream, salted caramel, coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, etc. So go to built.com, and when you do, use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So, basically, any way you slice it, Matt Ryan is coming off one of the worst seasons he's ever had. And the hope is, the need is that he's going to improve in 2022. And when you look at the advanced metrics to sort of really judge that 2021 season, you look at Football Outsiders, their DVOA metric, which is a per play basis, and then they have the DR metric, which sort of translates that per play value to a yardage total. You look at Matt Ryan's career numbers in those metrics, in both of those metrics, 2021 was Matt Ryan's worst season. You look at Matt Ryan's Pro Football Focus grade. This was the second worst grade in 2021 that he's had other than 2009. You look at his expected points or EPA per play, which typically is focused on sort of explosiveness and critical plays on third and fourth downs and touchdowns and all these various things. Uh, Matt Ryan's had his worst season in 2021. And then again, you look at ESPN's total QBR metric, um, which is also somewhat based on expected points. Also, Matt Ryan's career worst year. So one of the things I looked at is, going back to this pattern that we've seen consistently repeat itself, where Matt Ryan struggles in year one of a coordinator, starting in 2015 with Kyle Shanahan, and improving the following year in year two, to sort of see, okay, what's the average improvement that Matt Ryan has made over those last three transitions to maybe tell us, inform us what we can expect from Matt Ryan in 2022. So looking at the improvement from 2015 to 2016, the improvement from 2017 to 2018 under Sark, and then 2019 and 2020 to Dirk Cutter, and sort of looking at these four metrics, DR, PFF, EPA per play, and total QBR, to sort of see, okay, what can we expect? And if you apply essentially the average improvement that he showed across those three time spans, you could expect in terms of DR, Matt Ryan's 2022 numbers will probably be on par with Mac Jones, around 13th in the NFL. His PFF grade will be about on par with Mac Jones for 11th best in the NFL. His EPA per play would be 20th best in the NFL behind Tua Tagovailoa, and then his QBR would be 19th best behind Tua. So not necessarily massive improvements in those regards where we're looking at Matt Ryan having a really great season. Now, let's understand that when we look across these metrics, there was a massive improvement for Matt Ryan under Shanahan from 2015 to 2016, a modest improvement from 2017 and 2018 under Sark, and in some of these metrics, actually a small decline from 2017 to 2018. And then you had another sort of significant jump from Dirk Cutter from 2019 to 2020, but not anywhere close to what we saw in 15 and 16. And so if you were to assume, okay, well, maybe Matt Ryan can make a comparable jump from 2021 to 2022, like he did in 2015 to 16, that would probably mean across these four metrics, pretty much across the board, he would finish somewhere in the top 6 to 10 quarterbacks in all of these metrics if he had a comparable jump from 2021 into 2022. I don't have that level of optimism that Matt Ryan is about to make that type of leap, largely due to the fact that I don't put Arthur Smith on the same, pedestal as Kyle Shanahan. Although, as I've mentioned many times on the podcast over the last couple of months, if you would rewound the clock to January of 2016, right after the heels of that 2015 season, I didn't necessarily have Kyle Shanahan on that type of pedestal either. So we could be wrong in that regard. But I also don't think the environment, or I'm not expecting at this point in time that the environment that Matt Ryan's going to find himself in 2022 is going to be significantly better to potentially compensate if Arthur Smith isn't that caliber of play caller to make it that a likely outcome. And particularly if you are one of the Falcon fans that still refuse to give Kyle Shanahan any of the credit for the improvement that the team in the offense made in 2016, and you want to say it's Alex Mack and Taylor Gabriel and Mohamed Sanu were the causes of all that sort of stuff. But we know going into 2022, bottom line is that Matt Ryan's going to need to have a big year. It's kind of a make or break year for Matt Ryan. And, we can sit here and insist all day long that Matt Ryan is not the problem, which I 100% agree with. He is not the problem. But the real issue, I think, moving forward is not really about whether Matt Ryan is the problem. It's whether or not Matt Ryan is the solution. And I think you look back at how the Falcons have built themselves, particularly over this last decade. They've built themselves and they've believed themselves to be a team that was capable of winning a Super Bowl, and have tried to build a winner, a team capable of winning a Super Bowl around Matt Ryan. And of course, we're all aware as Falcon fans of how close they have gotten to achieving that. But unfortunately, they've fallen a little short. And the question is going to be, moving forward, do the Falcons adopt a similar approach, which is continuing to build around Matt Ryan as if this team is only a few pieces away. And I think this upcoming season is going to really sort of determine that, right? If we're basing it purely off of the 2021 season, it looked like the Falcons are pretty far away from being a Super Bowl team, let alone a playoff team, based off of how they performed against some of the better teams that they face this upcoming season. And essentially, the argument I'm making, unless the Falcons can show a significant leap in year two under Arthur Smith to close that gap, I'm not sitting here saying that the Falcons have to go to the NFC Championship game next year, but if they're not at least in a position next year where they're in a similar place at the very least to where teams like the Chargers or the Browns or the Saints currently are, which is teams that were on the cusp of making the playoffs. And certainly when we compare them to some of the teams that we saw this past weekend in the playoffs, we can sit there and make a case that maybe they would have been better options than some of those teams, and certainly capable of being playoff teams and teams that are maybe one or two pieces away from, not only making the playoffs, but potentially winning a playoff game. If the Falcons can't hit that sort of benchmark, I think that's going to spell trouble for this team moving forward, but also particularly Matt Ryan. And ultimately, when we're having this conversation and this debate that we've had over the last several months about, how much of the Falcons problem is related to lack of talent, that's really what we're, talking about is, do the Falcons have enough talent to be that sort of team? And essentially the argument that so many people have been making in that time, probably to some of them unbeknownst to them, they've been making these arguments as a way to excuse Matt Ryan's performance. But I think ultimately what you're really arguing is that if we're that far away from a talent standpoint, then why does it really make any sense to continue to invest significant resources, i.e. cap space, into the quarterback position? And, before we move on, let me make it clear. I'm not necessarily blaming the Falcons' lack of talent or their struggles on the fact that Matt Ryan's contract exists. As I've explained several times, the Falcons whiffing on free agents, whiffing on draft picks, blowing late game situations isn't because Matt Ryan's making, X amount of dollars. Those are separate issues. But it is one of those things that when you look at sort of the direction of the team, it doesn't really make a ton of sense that if you're, several years away from being not only a playoff team, but a Super Bowl contender, why does it make really any sense to continue to pay your quarterback a significant premium if he's not necessarily solving that problem and shortening your timeline? And, so far that conversation has basically revolved around the idea because the Falcons don't really have better options. And the point I'm trying to make is if Matt Ryan can't show that he is the best option for this team moving forward in 2022, it's going to be time for the Falcons to start looking at finding a potentially better option. And that may come as early as this upcoming draft. And that's what we're going to get into as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, talking about the backup quarterback position and whether or not that is a potential draft pick that could wind up being that better option down the road than necessarily Matt Ryan moving forward. But before we get into all of that, I want to let you guys know that if you check out the Peacock and Williamson NFL show, one of the flagship national shows here on the Locked On Podcast Network, they are going on the road next month to visit LA for Super Bowl week. And of course, you can follow the Peacock and Williamson NFL show today. So make sure that you get that comprehensive coverage, not only of the Super Bowl in a couple of weeks, but of course, all the things going on around the NFL between now and then. And of course, Peacock and Williamson is free and available on the same podcast platforms, of course, that you can find Locked On Falcons. And, talking about building up to the Super Bowl with Peacock and Williamson, Brian and Matt, you got to build up to the Super Bowl with some money so that you can lay it all down on Super Sunday. And of course, BetOnline remains the number one spot for all your sports wagering action, not only later this year in the Super Bowl, but throughout the year of 2022. It's a new year. And of course, there's a new website at betonline.ag. Make sure you head over there, sign up today, and use the promo code Locked On. You'll get a 50% welcome bonus. That means if you deposit $200, you get $100 in free money to play with. And whether you're betting on football, basketball, hockey, boxing, UFC, all the way to your favorite Vegas casino games, BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. And just in case you guys needed an update, yes, I did win my 3-team parlay. So I got a nice little bit of money ahead of my birthday. And I appreciate everybody that wished me a happy birthday on Tuesday, where most of you guys aren't listening to this. But if you want to get yourself a little bit of birthday scratch, go head on over to Bet Online where the game starts. So, one of the issues that the Falcons are going to have to deal with, as I've just discussed, is, you know, 2022 potentially being Matt Ryan's last shot to prove that he can be a solution at the quarterback position. And essentially, if he can't, or more accurately, if the team cannot, then I feel like we're getting to that time where it's time to start cutting the cord and moving on. Um, I think, I say that because it's tough because, to a lot of folks, that's disrespectful to Matt Ryan, given all that he's done for this organization, which I understand perfectly. But at a certain point, you got to build towards the future, and you can't be stuck in the past. And potentially that future comes this April. And one of the things I discussed earlier this week on Tuesday was the idea behind the Falcons drafting a quarterback and why it made total sense. And I feel like the circumstances that the Falcons find themselves as they look towards the future, starting this offseason, and particularly this draft, means that the Falcons are going to have to be looking to draft a quarterback on probably day 2 of this 2022 draft. And, I've gotten some feedback from some of you guys, and some of you, I think, are a little too focused on the idea that I have expressed myself in the past, that drafting quarterbacks on day 2 is essentially a waste of a pick because of the low hit rate on finding franchise guys. And while, the math hasn't changed in that regard, I think you're missing the big picture at this point in time. The big picture is that the Falcons are in a position, and have been in a position for the last year, where it may be time to turn the page on the quarterback position. And now, they're more so than last year, was the argument I essentially made on Tuesday, is that they're moving towards that direction. And really, when you look at the best option available for the Falcons this offseason when it comes to the quarterback position and addressing that backup quarterback position, potentially the future of the position in 2023 and beyond, it revolves around taking a day 2 quarterback in this upcoming draft. And so really, ultimately, the analytics, the stats, or whatever, when we talk about the hit rate, doesn't really matter and should be overlooked in this case. But I'm sure plenty of you will still argue against it for a variety of reasons. And I'm not necessarily prepared to go a deep dive on that and to rehash all the points I made on Tuesday's episode. So I go recommend you checking out that episode if you want to get more of those sort of main bullet points and get more detailed argument for that. But essentially, I will rehash it in the sense that, drafting a quarterback makes total sense because, largely, for no other reason, whether we're divorcing it from the conversation around whether we're drafting a potential replacement for Matt Ryan, it's more of immediate need because the backup quarterback situation that the Falcons are currently find themselves in is terrible, right? We watched AJ McCarron, who was basically their short-term solution, signing last year, and instead of drafting a quarterback on day 2, we saw him struggle this past summer. And while I was a vocal defender of AJ McCarron and his performance this past summer, I will not sit here and tell you that he played inspiring football that makes me want to sort of dip back into that well again or anything like that. Basically, the argument I made was like he was a 4 out of 10 rather than the 2 out of 10 that people portrayed him as. But like, why are we going back to a 4 out of 10? Even in that situation? And of course, the other option that we had last summer, Felipe Franks, who wound up sticking on the team. Of course, AJ McCarron got injured, suffered a season-ending injury. But Felipe Franks, who did stick on with the roster, the most notable thing that Felipe Franks did this season, other than be terrible when he got on the football field in some garbage time moments, was, dabbling as a tight end and playing on special teams and basically being the Falcons version of Taysom Hill. But the fact that the Falcons dabbled with converting Felipe Franks to tight end, which may still wind up being on the table this offseason, kind of tells you that he's not really an option for the team as far as a QB2 goes. And then you couple that with the fact that even despite that issue, he still surpassed Josh Rosen on the depth chart, seemingly based off of who was active and inactive on game day. Kind of tells you that whole Josh Rosen reclamation project that so many of you guys were excited about last August. And you guys know the thing I hate the most as I adjust my glasses, and actually, you guys to death. But, the thing I hate to do, so often, and don't judge by the smile on my face. But I hate it when I have to say I told you so when it comes to that whole Josh Rosen reclamation project. And you guys insisted that Atlanta is the perfect environment for him to be reclaimed because Arthur Smith and then Matt Ryan and all these various things. And that did not go particularly well as what we saw in 2021. And so the Falcons need to find a new backup quarterback. And, obviously the alternative to drafting one is signing one. And certainly in a world, and primarily the world that we have been existing in for the last several years, going back to the past, where we were wholly committed to Matt Ryan being the starter for the foreseeable future, for 3 to 5 more years, going with a veteran quarterback made total sense. But we're not in that world, as I have basically outlined on today's episode. And certainly in a world which has been the primary world that the Falcons have believed that they lived in, although, the actuality on the field did not necessarily prove that, but the world that they believed themselves to be in, which was a playoff and Super Bowl contender, going with going with a veteran like Matt Schaub made complete sense, because you wanted to have that experienced backup that in the event that you wound up losing Matt Ryan for a game or two, because you're a Super Bowl team, and you need to have a backup that can come in there and toss for 460 yards in a game that could wind up deciding your fate, not only as a playoff team, but potential playoff seeding. And so that made total sense. But again, as I'm sure most of you are aware, it doesn't appear that the Falcons are operating in that sort of world where we're, a game or two away from making the playoffs or winning a Super Bowl. We'll see. And so to me, the idea of going out and signing a veteran free agent to be the QB2 just doesn't really make a ton of sense. And then you couple that with, the thing that many of you are concerned about with, the Falcons' tight cap situation. Frankly, drafting a quarterback will probably be considerably cheaper and the best bang for your buck to maximize who that QB2 is. Because when you look at, say, the 43rd overall pick, which is the Falcons pick that they own at the top of round 2, based off of overthecap.com's projections, that player is going to have a cap hit of roughly $1.6 million this upcoming season. And if you go out there and sign any capable veteran backup, any quality guy, he's probably going to cost you more than $1.6 million. So if you're looking for a new sort of reclamation project like a Mitchell Trubisky or Marcus Mariota, given that those guys are making more than that in a depressed salary cap year, probably going to make more than that, certainly $1.6 million in a year where the cap is expected to rebound a little bit more. And then you can certainly still find a veteran cheaper than $1.6 million. AJ McCarron qualifies as that. And you can get a guy for the veteran minimum, which is around $1 million this upcoming season. So that's going to be cheaper. But the types of players that you're going to wind up getting are going to be the AJ McCarron types, which we already kind of been down that road and know it doesn't necessarily lead to positive results. And or you're going to have to go out there and settle for a veteran quarterback like a Brian Hoyer that's basically the same age as Matt Ryan. So what's the point of that? Or if you go young at that position, you're probably going to wind up settling for like a Nick Mullins or a Josh Rosen type, which we already know is probably not going to lead to positive outcomes. So essentially, it boils down whether you think this quarterback has the potential to surpass Matt Ryan. The point I'm still going to make, the argument I'm still going to continue to make, is drafting a quarterback still makes the most sense, just purely to find a decent backup behind Matt Ryan, let alone the potential that the team could wind up finding a halfway decent starter down the road with development time. Even if you believe that Matt Ryan's still going to play another 2 or 3 years in Atlanta, that's 2 or 3 years that you can develop this backup to potentially take over from Matt Ryan, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, or whatever the case may be. So to me, the potential reward is well worth the potential risk that the quarterback winds up being a whiff if you take that guy in day 2. And of course, if all roads point to the Falcons drafting a quarterback, of course, the higher you draft that quarterback makes more sense. Simple analogy is why settle for Sean Renfree when you can draft Geno Smith? And I use that example because, of course, both of those guys were drafted in 2013. The last time, by the way, that the Falcons drafted a quarterback was Sean Renfree in round 7 at the very end of that draft. And in 2013, notably comparable to what a lot of people say about this 2022 draft class, was a year that was known to be a down quarterback year. We saw EJ Manuel be the lone first round pick, and that didn't work out for Buffalo. And the two best quarterbacks from that draft class were day 2 selections. That was Geno Smith and Mike Glennon. Mike Glennon personally was my QB1 that year. Geno Smith was my QB2. A lot of people thought Geno Smith should and would have been a top 5, top 10 pick. But, I had the vision that he wasn't as good as that hyped up to be. But I sit there and I tell you that. And when you have a down year, typically, the odds seem to be in your favor that the day 2 selections tend to turn out a little bit better than usual. But I know Geno Smith and Mike Glennon type examples aren't necessarily all inspiring. Mike Glennon was the best quarterback that year, Aaron, that you're not making me feel better about drafting quarterback. But I will add, and again, I haven't done a deep dive on this quarterback class, but I will add my initial impression, at least of like Carson Strong, is that he's probably on par, if not better. Again, I haven't done a deep enough dive to say this with conviction, but my initial impression is that, yeah, he should be a quarterback on par with what Mike Glennon was. And Mike Glennon was arguably the best quarterback in that 2013 draft class. Again, I know that's not saying much, but the point of me pointing that out is not to sit here and tell you, hey, landing Mike Glennon is a great pick, but in this year's particular draft class, at least the consensus seems to be, and we'll see if this changes over the next couple of months, but the consensus is that Carson Strong is probably the 5th or 6th best quarterback in this year's draft class, and he's already better than arguably the best quarterback. So I say all that because, we're going to hear a lot of conversation about, oh, this is a terrible quarterback class, and it's like, I think basically the point I'm sitting here saying is, like, I think the worst case scenario is the Falcons find a Mike Glennon or Geno Smith type of player if they draft a quarterback. I think the odds are much higher that they're going to find a much better player than that. So that's kind of the point of me bringing that up. So again, I think it all points to the Falcons drafting a quarterback and hoping that Matt Ryan rebounds and has a good year. And hopefully that backup quarterback winds up just riding the bench for a number of years and potentially could be developed to be a starter down the road. And while that won't necessarily pay the immediate dividends that I know a lot of people are hoping this draft class is going to have, again, I will continue to stress this all off season long, that, going into a draft expecting to have immediate payoff is generally going to be a losing strategy. So that's not generally how the draft works. It's, you draft guys and hopefully it pays off to you 2, 3, 4 years down the road. So drafting quarterback doesn't change that, is essentially the argument I will continue to make. But, if you want to provide your feedback on anything I've discussed on today's episode or anything you want me to discuss on future episodes, of course, you can provide that feedback by hitting me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, on Facebook or Twitter. Of course, you can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And tomorrow's episode, I think we'll talk about the defense in a similar way that we talked on yesterday's episode about the offense and sort of what are sort of the main issues that the team has to sort of rebuild there. We'll probably talk a little bit about, scheme and DMPs. And so those are observations. That's where I'm leaning today. And then that will leave us probably Friday's episode to get into the next position group on the year-end positional reviews, which is the running back position, to wrap up the week. So that's the plan right now. And of course, make sure you stay tuned to the Locked On Falcons podcast, your first listen each and every day. But, now that we're wrapping up Locked On Falcons, what about a recommendation for your second listen? And of course, got to recommend Locked On Bets with handicapping expert Lee Sterling, giving you his daily picks, his blowout specials, and of course, Lee's lock of the day to help you win money when you go to BetOnline that you can then use to buy all those Built bars at Built.com. So go check out the Locked On Bets podcast, free and available on the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. So guys, I appreciate it. Until then.